The clock on the wall ticked with a hollow sound. It was a sound that seemed to mock him. Each tick was another second closer to midnight. Each tick was another second he was away from his own bed. He leaned heavily on the mop handle, feeling the cheap wood press into his palm. The fluorescent lights of the deserted office building hummed a low, mournful tune. They cast long, distorted shadows that danced around him like ghosts of his former self. His back ached with a deep, persistent throb. It was the kind of ache that settled into your bones and reminded you of every long hour you had ever worked. He was not just tired, he was worn down to the very core of his being. His name was David. He was 53 years old. He should have been at home, maybe watching a late-night movie with his wife. He should have been resting, preparing for his day job tomorrow. Instead, he was here. He was mopping floors in a building where people younger than his own children made more in a day than he made in a week from this second job. The smell of industrial-grade cleaner filled his nostrils, a sharp chemical scent that clung to his clothes and his skin. It was the perfume of his new reality, a reality he never imagined for himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, just a brief moment, trying to summon an ounce of strength to finish the last hallway. The weight he carried was more than just physical exhaustion. It was the heavy burden of failure. It was the crushing pressure of mounting debt in a world that seemed to get more expensive with every breath he took. He had worked his whole life. He had been a responsible man, a good provider, or so he had thought. But the numbers didn't lie. The bills on the kitchen table told a different story. They spoke of a man who was falling behind, a man who was slowly drowning in a sea of financial obligations. This second job, this nightly ritual of cleaning up after others, was his desperate attempt to keep his head above water. It was his penance. He pushed the mop forward, the wet slosh echoing in the empty corridor. The gray water swirled in the bucket, a murky reflection of his own muddled thoughts. He remembered a time when he had dreams, aspirations that went beyond just surviving until the next paycheck. He had wanted to travel. He had wanted to build a deck in the backyard. Simple dreams. But they felt like luxuries from another lifetime now. His world had shrunk to the size of this office building, to the length of this hallway, to the repetitive motion of a mop sliding across dirty linoleum. The weight wasn't just on his shoulders, it was on his soul, pressing down, relentless and unforgiving. He paused his work in front of the large glass doors at the building's entrance. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a world away. He saw his reflection in the glass superimposed over the faint glow of the streetlights. It was a ghost staring back at him, a tired, older man he barely recognized. His face was etched with lines of worry. His eyes were now dull and hollow, shadowed by weariness. The cheap, ill-fitting uniform hung off his frame. He looked defeated. This was not the man his wife had married. That man was proud. That man stood tall. He could fix anything, solve any problem. This man in the reflection looked broken. He lifted a hand and touched the cold glass, his fingers tracing the outline of his own tired face. A wave of shame washed over him, hot and sharp. Shame for being here. Shame for needing this job. Shame for what he had become. He was a provider who could no longer provide enough. He was a husband who brought home the smell of bleach instead of success. He was a father failing at the one thing that mattered most. He thought about his daughter Sarah. Her wedding was just a few months away. It was supposed to be the happiest time of her life. He had always dreamed of walking her down the aisle, but the dream was turning into a nightmare of spreadsheets and impossible numbers. The cost of everything was staggering. Every night he spent here, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans, was a stark reminder of his inability to give her the celebration he'd promised. The man in the glass knew this secret. His eyes held the silent confession of a father's broken promise. He turned away from the reflection, unable to bear the sight. The image was too honest, too brutal. It showed him the truth he tried to ignore during the day. During his day job as a warehouse manager, he could still pretend. He could put on a brave face, bark orders, and feel a semblance of control, but here, in the silence of the night, there was no one to pretend for. There was only him, the mop, and the damning reflection in the glass. He picked up his bucket and moved on, trying to walk away from the man he had just seen, but knowing he was inescapable. The ghost followed him down the hall. The quiet hum of the floor polisher was a constant drone, a monotonous soundtrack to his nightly labor, but in his mind the noise was much louder. It was a chaotic chorus of ringing phones and unopened envelopes. It was the echo of conversations with his wife, whispered late at night so the kids wouldn't hear. Conversations filled with phrases like final notice and not enough this month. Each bill was a small paper cut, and now he felt like he was bleeding out from 1,000 tiny wounds. The mortgage, the car payments, the credit card debt that had started small but had grown into a monster. It was a relentless tide, and he was losing ground with every wave. He remembered the day the letter about the property tax increase arrived. He had held the crisp white envelope in his hand, feeling its weight. It felt heavier than it should. When he opened it, the numbers seemed to jump off the page. It was another unexpected blow, another punch to the gut when he was already doubled over. He and his wife, Linda, had sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long time. There was nothing to say. The numbers spoke for themselves. They were already stretched to their absolute limit. That was the night he started looking for a second job, scrolling through online listings with a heavy heart, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his strained face in the dark room. The shame was a constant companion. It sat on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He felt it most acutely when he was around his family. He tried to act normal, to smile, to laugh at dinner, but he felt like an imposter. They saw their father, their husband. He saw a man who was failing them. He saw a man who had to sneak out of his own house late at night like a teenager, not for fun, but to go clean someone else's toilets. He would lie and say he was going out for a walk or to meet a friend, anything to avoid the truth. The lie was almost as heavy as the debt itself, another brick on his already overburdened back. He pushed the polisher across a patch of scuffed flooring, watching as it slowly began to shine under the rotating pad. If only he could polish his life so easily. If only he could buff out the scratches and scuffs of his financial mistakes. But life wasn't like a linoleum floor. The marks were deeper, the damage harder to repair. The echoes of the bills followed him here, into this empty building. They were in the hum of the machine, in the squeak of his rubber-soled shoes, in the hollow sound of his own breathing. There was no escaping them. They were the ghosts that haunted his every waking moment, and especially these long, lonely nights. The uniform was made of a cheap, scratchy polyester. The color was a drab, forgettable gray, the kind of color designed to make you invisible. It had a small, generic logo embroidered on the chest, Apex Cleaning Services. When he put it on each night, he felt like he was putting on a costume that stripped him of his identity. He was no longer David, the warehouse manager, the husband, the father. He was just a cleaner, a nameless, faceless part of the night crew. The fabric was stiff and uncomfortable, a constant irritating reminder of his circumstances. It smelled faintly of the industrial-strength detergents he used, a scent that clung to him long after his shift ended. He kept the uniform in a duffel bag in the trunk of his car. The change happened in a dark corner of the office building's underground parking garage. The transition was a nightly ritual of shame. He would shed the clothes of his day life, the clothes of a man with some authority and respect, and pull on the gray shroud of his nightlife. He was careful not to be seen. The thought of a coworker from his day job or even a neighbor stumbling upon him in this state was a terrifying prospect. In this uniform he moved through the building like a ghost. The daytime employees, the ones who left coffee cup rings on their desks, crumbs on the break room floor, never saw him. He was an unseen force that made their workspace clean again by morning. He was part of the magic of a functioning office, the silent, invisible labor that no one ever thought about. He was acutely aware of this invisibility. In some ways it was a blessing. It allowed him to hide, but in other ways it was profoundly dehumanizing. To be unseen is to be unacknowledged. To be unacknowledged is to feel like you don't matter. He caught his reflection in the polished chrome of an elevator door. The gray uniform seemed to drain the color from his face, making him look pale and spectral. He looked like a man who had given up, a man who had accepted his fate as a ghost in the machine of other people's lives. But deep down, a small defiant spark still flickered. He hated this uniform. He hated what it represented. He hated the feeling of the cheap fabric against his skin, and with every night he wore it, that hatred grew. It was a slow-burning fire, a quiet rage that was beginning to smolder beneath the surface of his exhaustion and shame. The uniform was meant to make him invisible, but it was starting to make him see his own situation with a painful, undeniable clarity. The image of his daughter Sarah was a constant presence in his mind. He saw her as a little girl, her hand lost in his as they walked through the park. He saw her at her high school graduation, her face beaming with pride and excitement for the future. He had always been her rock, the one person she could count on for anything. He had promised her, not always in words, but in 1,000 small actions, that he would always be there to support her, to provide for her, to make her dreams possible. Now, With her wedding approaching, that unspoken promise felt like a lead weight in his stomach. He was breaking it. The wedding planning had started with such joy. Sarah and her fiancé Mark would come over for dinner, their faces alight with plans and ideas. They talked about venues, flowers, guest lists. David would sit and nod, a forced smile on his face while his mind raced with calculations. Each choice, each decision, came with a price tag that made his breath catch in his throat. The venue she loved was thousands of dollars. The caterer, the photographer, the dress. It all added up to a sum that was simply impossible for him. The joy in his daughter's eyes was a dagger in his heart. He avoided conversations about the wedding budget. When Sarah brought it up, he would become vague, changing the subject or promising they would talk about it later. The laters were piling up. He could feel her confusion and a hint of disappointment. She didn't understand. How could she? He had always been the strong, capable father who could handle anything. She had no idea about his financial struggles, about the second job, about the shame that was eating him alive. He was protecting her from the truth, but in doing so, he was creating a chasm between them. The silence was filled with unspoken fears and unfulfilled promises. One night, while cleaning a conference room, he found a discarded wedding magazine on a table. He picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the glossy photo of a smiling bride. The pages were filled with images of extravagant flowers, elegant gowns, fairy tale receptions. It was a world of effortless perfection, a world so far removed from his reality of mopping floors to make ends meet. He felt a surge of anger and frustration, anger at his circumstances, frustration with himself. He wasn't just failing to pay for a party, he felt like he was failing his daughter on the most important day of her life. The unspoken promise had become an unbearable burden. The drive to his second job was the loneliest part of his day. It was a 20-minute journey through darkening suburban streets and onto a deserted highway. The sun had already set, leaving behind a bruised purple sky. He drove his old, reliable sedan, the engine humming a familiar, weary tune. This was his time of transition, the space between his two lives. He would leave his home, where he was a husband and father, and drive toward the office building where he would become a janitor. The man who left the driveway was not the same man who would arrive in the parking garage. Something was lost along the way. His pride, perhaps. During the drive, his mind was a battlefield. Thoughts of his day job, the pressures and responsibilities, clashed with the dread of the night ahead. The 42 trash cans to empty, the 6 bathrooms to scrub, the thousands of square feet of flooring to mop and buff. The sheer volume of the work was overwhelming. He would grip the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as a wave of exhaustion washed over him before he had even started. Some nights, the temptation to just keep driving, to leave it all behind, was a seductive whisper in the back of his mind. But he always made the turn, he always showed up. The radio was usually off. He preferred the silence. It allowed the weight of his thoughts to settle. He would replay conversations, analyze bills, and try to find a way out of the financial maze he was trapped in. But no matter how many times he ran the numbers, the conclusion was always the same. He was stuck. This nightly grind was his only option. The drive became a ritual of resignation. He would watch the familiar landmarks pass by, the all-night diner, the closed-down strip mall, the old water tower. They were signposts on his road to nightly servitude, each one bringing him closer to the uniform and the mop. As he pulled into the vast, empty parking lot of the office park, the building loomed before him like a tomb. Its windows were dark, its presence imposing and indifferent. He would park in the furthest corner, a habit born of his desire for anonymity. For a few moments he would just sit in his car, the engine off, gathering the will to get out. This was the final moment of being himself. He would take a deep breath, the air in the car stale with the scent of his own anxiety. Then, he would open the door and step out into the cool night air, ready to descend into the darkness and begin the long, lonely hours of work that awaited him. The conversation he had been dreading for weeks finally happened. It was a Tuesday night, after a simple dinner of pasta and sauce. Sarah had brought her wedding binder to the table again. It was a thick white 3-ring binder, already overflowing. Fabric swatches, magazine clippings, printed out quotes.
Dad, we found a potential caterer. They're amazing, but they need a deposit by the end of the month to hold the date.
She slid a glossy brochure across the table towards him. David looked at the brochure, the images blurred. All he could see was a number that made his stomach clench. He took a slow breath, air feeling heavy. He looked at his wife, Linda, watching him with worried eyes. She knew they couldn't afford it. He couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. The lies were too heavy.
Sarah, honey, we need to talk about the budget.
The light in his daughter's eyes dimmed. She closed the binder slowly, posture shifting to guarded. The joyful energy evaporated into tense silence. The hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening.
What about the budget, Dad?
David struggled for words.
Things are a little tight right now.
He stared at the wood grain, tracing the lines with his eyes. He explained vaguely that costs were higher and his salary wasn't stretching. The message landed. The grand wedding wasn't possible. Sarah was quiet, processing. Her disappointment filled the room.
Oh, I see.
But she didn't see the full picture. She didn't see him sneaking out at night to clean floors. She didn't see the stack of final notice bills hidden in his desk drawer. She only saw her father saying no. It wasn't a confession of his second job, but a confession of his failure, and it felt just as shameful. Later that night, after Sarah had gone home and the house was quiet, David sat alone at the kitchen table. It was, honestly, the scene of his earlier failure. He pulled out the shoebox he kept hidden in the bottom of the hall closet. It wasn't full of old photos or sentimental keepsakes. It was full of debt. He dumped the contents onto the table, a mountain of paper spread out before him under the harsh kitchen light. Credit card statements, medical bills from Linda's surgery 2 years ago, loan documents for the car, the ever-present mortgage statement. Each piece of paper was a link in the chain dragging him down. He felt like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of his own financial life. He picked up a credit card bill. The red ink of the past due stamp screamed at him. The balance was shocking. He remembered when they first got the card. For emergencies only, they'd said. But then the water heater broke. Then the car needed new tires. Small emergencies snowballed into an avalanche of debt. Interest rates were crippling, a legal form of punishment for not having enough money. He paid hundreds a month just in interest. It felt like running on a treadmill that kept speeding up. He spread the bills out, trying to organize the chaos. It was a futile exercise. The numbers were relentless. The total owed was staggering, more like a small business than a family. He felt a wave of nausea. He'd always tried to live within his means. A layoff a few years back, rising insurance costs, the grinding inflation of everyday goods, a slow, creeping erosion until he was neck-deep in the flood. He put his head in his hands, rough paper crinkling under his elbows. The weight was suffocating. This mountain of paper was the secret he carried every day. It kept him awake at night. It was why he wore the gray Apex Cleaning Services uniform. It was why he'd crushed his daughter's dreams at this table earlier. The paper wasn't just money owed. It was his mistakes. It was his misfortunes. It was his failure as a provider. He sat, surrounded by evidence of his struggle, a silent king on a throne of debt. As David pushed his mop down the long, empty hallway of the office building, his mind was no longer blank with exhaustion. It was buzzing. After the conversation with Sarah and the grim accounting with the shoebox of bills, something inside him had shifted. The numb resignation was slowly being replaced by a cold, hard anger. An anger at his situation, an anger at himself. He was no longer just going through the motions of his second job, he was calculating. But this was a different kind of calculation. It wasn't about how much he owed, it was about how much he needed to earn, to get out. With each swipe of the mop, he did the math. The wedding venue cost $10,000. That was approximately 1,250 hours of mopping floors at his current wage, before taxes. He pictured himself scrubbing this same hallway, night after night, for months on end, just to pay for the building where his daughter would get married. The thought was both absurd and infuriating. The photographer was another 5,625 more hours. The numbers were no longer just abstract figures on a page, they were hours of his life. They were moments he would never get back, spent in this soulless building, away from his family. This new perspective changed his work. It was no longer just a job, it was a mission. He began to see his time here not as a punishment, but as a unit of currency. Each hour was a small deposit into the Freedom account. He started timing himself, pushing to see if he could finish a floor 10 minutes faster, if he could clean an extra bathroom in the same amount of time. He wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. He was working to buy back his pride. He was working to pay for his daughter's dream. The exhaustion was still there, a lead weight in his bones, but now it was accompanied by a fierce, desperate sense of purpose. The shame hadn't vanished. It was still there, a constant shadow, but now it had a new companion, resolve. He would look at his reflection in the dark glass and see the same tired man in the cheap gray uniform. But now, he saw a flicker of defiance in the man's eyes. He wasn't just a victim of his circumstances anymore. He was a man with a plan. A desperate, exhausting, and perhaps foolish plan, but a plan nonetheless. The calculations continued, a frantic abacus clicking in his mind. The caterer, the band, the flowers. Each one was a new number, a new target, a new mountain of hours to climb. The climb seemed impossible, but for the first time in a long time he was looking up. The shame had been a crushing weight, a force that pushed David down into a dark pit of despair. It had made him invisible, silent, a stranger to his own family. But pressure, when applied intensely enough, can do more than just crush. It can create diamonds. The resentment that had started to fester within him was a toxic, dangerous emotion, but it was also a form of energy. It was a hot, angry fire that began to burn away the fog of his exhaustion and hopelessness. He was tired of feeling weak. He was tired of feeling like a victim. The shame was still there, but now, it was no longer just a source of pain. It was becoming a source of fuel. A spark had ignited in the ashes of his pride. This spark was a tiny defiant thought that flickered one night as he was emptying a recycling bin in the marketing department. He saw a stack of discarded magazines all about business and finance. On a whim, he pulled one out. The cover story was about a man who had started a successful online business from his garage. David scoffed at first. It sounded like a fantasy, another story from a world he didn't belong to. But he tucked the magazine into his duffel bag anyway. Later, sitting in his car before driving home, he read the article. The story wasn't about magic, it was about hard work, identifying a need, taking a small, calculated risk. It was about starting small. The idea was absurd. He was a 53-year-old janitor and warehouse manager drowning in debt. What kind of business could he possibly start? He had no money, no special skills, and barely any time. And yet, the idea wouldn't leave him. It was a tiny pinprick of light in the overwhelming darkness of his situation. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something other than fear or shame. It was a dangerous, fragile feeling, hope. The second job had been an act of desperation, a way to tread water. This new idea, however small and ridiculous, felt different. It felt like it could be a step toward shore. The spark grew into a small, steady flame. The shame hadn't disappeared, but its nature was changing. It was no longer just a weight holding him down. It was becoming a force pushing him forward. He was ashamed of his situation, and that shame was now motivating him to change it, not just endure it. He was tired of cleaning up after other people's successes. He wanted one of his own, no matter how small. He didn't know how. He didn't know what he would do. But he knew he had to do something. The nightly grind was no longer just a penance. It was becoming a launch pad. He was at the bottom, and there was nowhere to go but up. The idea came from the most unlikely of places, the trash. As part of his nightly duties, David was responsible for breaking down dozens of cardboard boxes left by the office's mailroom. It was a mindless physical task. He would flatten them and stack them for the recycling pickup. One night, as he was wrestling with a particularly large box, he noticed that many of them were in perfect condition. They were sturdy, clean, and came in all shapes and sizes. He also noticed the sheer volume of them. The company was throwing away a small mountain of high-quality cardboard every single week. An idea, born from the magazine article he had read, began to form in his mind. He remembered seeing posts on a local community forum online. People who were moving were always looking for boxes. They would pay a small amount for a bundle of used, sturdy boxes rather than buying expensive new ones from a moving supply store. It was a simple, almost laughably small idea. Could he collect these discarded boxes, bundle them, and sell them? The thought was both exciting and embarrassing. He would be, quite literally, selling trash. It felt like another step down the ladder of dignity. But then he thought about the numbers. The boxes were free. His car had a large trunk. It would cost him nothing but time and a little bit of effort. He decided to try it. He felt like a thief, even though he was just taking items that were destined for the recycling plant. He started selecting the best boxes each night. The clean ones, the strong ones, the ones with useful dimensions. He would flatten them carefully and stash them in a corner of the janitor's closet. At the end of his shift, he would load them into his car, his heart pounding, half expecting someone to stop him and accuse him of stealing. He felt foolish. This was his grand business plan, selling used cardboard boxes. It seemed pathetic compared to the stories in the magazines. But when he got home, he stacked the boxes neatly in a corner of his garage. The next day, during his lunch break at the warehouse, he took a photo of the stack and posted a simple ad online. 50 sturdy moving boxes, assorted sizes, $25. He felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach after he hit post. He expected to be laughed at or, more likely, completely ignored. But within an hour he got a message. "Are these still available? I can pick them up tonight." David stared at his phone, his heart suddenly beating faster. It was a small thing, a tiny transaction, but it felt like a monumental shift. It was the first glimmer of proactive hope he had felt in a very long time. That evening, a young college student came to his house. David met him at the garage, feeling awkward and exposed. He felt the need to explain himself, to justify why he was selling used boxes. But the student didn't care. He was just happy to be saving money. He handed David a crisp $20 bill and a $5.
"This is great, man, thanks, you saved me a ton."
David stood in his driveway, holding the $25 in his hand. It wasn't much, it was less than 3 hours worth of work at his cleaning job, but this felt completely different. This was money he had created, not just earned. The $25 felt heavier in his hand than his regular paycheck. It was proof of a concept. He had taken something of no value, something that had been thrown away, and turned it into cash. He hadn't asked for a job, he hadn't filled out an application. He had simply seen an opportunity, a small inefficiency in the world, and capitalized on it. The feeling was intoxicating. It was a small taste of agency, of control, in a life that had felt completely out of his control. He went inside and put the $25 on the kitchen counter. When Linda came home, he told her what he had done. He expected her to think it was silly, but she just looked at him, a slow smile spreading across her face.
That's brilliant, David.
His nightly work at the office building was transformed. He was no longer just a janitor, he was a prospector, a treasure hunter sifting through the company's waste. He developed an eye for what was valuable. It wasn't just boxes. The marketing department often threw away high-quality poster tubes. The IT department discarded old but still functional keyboards and mice. He found a perfectly good office chair by the dumpster one night with a note that said "wobbly." He took it home, spent 10 minutes tightening a few bolts, and sold it the next day for $40. The building was a river of discarded assets, and he was panning for gold. This new hustle didn't solve his financial problems, not even close. The money he was making was a trickle, not a flood. But it changed his mindset completely. He was no longer just enduring his second job, he was using it. The shame of cleaning floors was still there, but it was now mixed with a sense of purpose, and even a little excitement. He started looking at the world differently, with the eyes of an entrepreneur. He was constantly asking himself, what is being wasted here? What problem can I solve? How can I turn this into something of value? The trash of other people's lives was becoming the foundation of his new beginning. David realized that to make this work, to turn his collection of small hustles into something resembling a real income stream, he needed to be organized. His garage, once a chaotic collection of salvaged goods, began to transform. Then it became a mini shipping station. He built shelves out of scrap wood. He created a small, dedicated space for taking photos, with a white sheet tacked to the wall for a clean background. He bought a cheap postage scale and a roll of packing tape. He was building the physical infrastructure for his digital business. It was a humble setup, a far cry from the sophisticated warehouse he managed during the day, but it was his. Every shelf he built felt like a victory. He also built a digital scaffolding. He created a spreadsheet to track his inventory, his sales, his profits, and his expenses. At first, the numbers were small, almost comical. A $5 profit here, a $10 profit there. But he tracked every single penny. This was the opposite of the shoebox full of bills that represented his debt. This spreadsheet represented his climb out of the hole. It was a document of progress, of growth. He would update it every night after his cleaning shift before he went to bed. Seeing the profit column slowly increase, even by a few dollars, was a powerful motivator. It was tangible evidence that his efforts were making a difference. He established a routine. His life became a tightly choreographed dance of work and hustling. His day job from 9 to 5, a quick dinner with Linda, then an hour or two in the garage, packing up the day's sales, then off to his cleaning job, which now doubled as a sourcing trip. He would get home after midnight, update his spreadsheet, and then spend another hour listing new items he had found. He was running on fumes, fueled by caffeine and sheer willpower. The deep, soul-crushing exhaustion was still there, but now it was mixed with the adrenaline of building something. It was a productive exhaustion. This process of building, both physically and digitally, was healing his battered sense of self. He was no longer just a victim of his circumstances, he was an architect of his own solution. He was the one creating the systems, making the decisions, and putting in the work. The man who felt he had lost all control was now meticulously controlling every aspect of his small but growing enterprise. The shame hadn't vanished, but it was being overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of competence and pride. He was building more than just shelves and spreadsheets. He was rebuilding his self-respect one sale at a time. As the money from his side business grew, David's thoughts kept returning to one thing: Sarah's wedding, the shame of that initial conversation. He was determined to turn that failure into a victory. He continued to deposit money into the wedding account, but he also started making secret investments in her dream. He knew he couldn't just hand her a lump sum. He wanted to show her he'd been listening. He wanted to give her back the pieces of her dream. He started with the caterer. He found the glossy brochure tucked in a drawer. He called the number. It was. He used a significant chunk of his savings to put down the deposit, securing the culinary artist his daughter had been so excited about. He didn't tell her right away. He kept the receipt in his wallet. It was his first major victory. Next, he went after the photographer. He remembered the website filled with beautiful, light-filled photos. David found the photographer's website again. He sent an email inquiring about the date and the packages. He negotiated a contract and, again, paid the deposit himself. One by one, he started secretly collecting the pieces of her perfect wedding. He wasn't just throwing money at the problem, he was carefully and lovingly reassembling her vision. Each deposit he made was a quiet act of redemption, a way of healing the wound his initial no had created. He kept a small folder, hidden in his desk drawer with the contracts and receipts. It was his secret project. Linda was his only co-conspirator. She would watch him, her face a mixture of love and awe as he made his calls and signed his name. He was no longer the defeated man who couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. He was a man with a plan, a secret benefactor working in the shadows. The grind was fueling not just his bank account, but his ability to act on his love for his family in the most tangible way possible. He was investing his sweat and exhaustion directly into his daughter's happiness. The following Sunday, David and Linda invited Sarah and her fiancé Mark over for lunch. The atmosphere was light and easy, a stark contrast to the tense, painful dinners of the past year.
After the meal, David cleared his throat, a nervous energy fluttering in his chest. "Sarah, honey," he began, "we need to talk about the wedding budget again."
Sarah's smile faltered for a second. David pulled out a simple, plain folder and placed it on the kitchen table, the same spot as before. He opened the folder. Inside, the contracts, and paid in full receipts. He slid the first one across the table.
Contract, caterer, glossy brochure, zero balance. Sarah's confused, stunned look. "Dad, I don't understand, we couldn't afford this."
David smiled and slid the next one. Contract, photographer she adored. Then, receipt for the deposit on the rustic barn venue. One by one he revealed the secret investments he'd made for months. He'd paid for every single thing she'd dreamed of.
Sarah looked from the pile to her father's face. Tears began to stream down her cheeks. Not disappointment, but joy. They were tears of overwhelming joy and disbelief. "How?" she whispered, voice choked.
David began to tell the whole story. He told her about the second job. He told her about the shame and the exhaustion, the boxes, the eBay store, the wholesale pallets, the small business he built in the shadows. He told it now with pride.
Sarah broke into sobs, a cathartic release. She stood and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "You didn't have to do all that," she cried into his shoulder.
"I know," he said, voice thick, "but I wanted to..."
In that moment, the pain of the past year melted away. He hadn't just paid for a wedding, he'd kept his promise and restored his honor. Looking back, David realized the profound, paradoxical truth. The second job, his source of shame and despair, had become his salvation. It was a crucible. It burned away his old self, stripped brittle pride, exposed hidden fears, and forged something stronger. Without the desperation that forced him into that gray uniform, he wouldn't have looked for another way. Without the nightly grind, he wouldn't have found the opportunity in the company's trash. What felt like a prison cell was actually a launch pad. The steady, small paycheck gave him stability to take risks. It was a safety net that let him invest his first $500 into a pallet of goods. It kept the lights on and the mortgage paid while he learned the ropes, made mistakes, and found his footing. Most founders leap without a net. His second job was his net. It let him build an escape route without the paralyzing fear of instant ruin. A burden meant to crush you can become leverage if you change perspective. He started feeling like a victim, crushed by circumstances. The moment he launched his first side hustle, everything began to shift. He stopped merely enduring. He used the job as a tool. It became a source of income, a source of inventory, a source of time to think. Long, lonely hours turned into productive planning. He turned his biggest liability into his greatest asset. This is the mindset split. Trapped people see only struggle. Centurions see opportunity. They treat the second job as a temporary strategy, a launch pad to freedom. David learned it the hard way, but it changed everything. The journey from shame to strategy is the most critical transformation a person can make. David's story is a testament to this powerful shift. For months, his shame was a paralyzing force. It isolated him. It eroded his self-worth. It made him a stranger in his own home. It was a purely negative emotion, a heavy anchor dragging him to the bottom. He was so focused on humiliation he couldn't see a way out. His energy was consumed by hiding his reality, by maintaining a mask of normalcy. Shame keeps you small. Shame keeps you quiet. Shame keeps you trapped in the dark, hoping no one will see you. The turning point was when his shame mixed with a growing resentment and curdled into a new kind of energy. It became fuel. He was no longer just ashamed, he became determined to change it. He was ashamed of it, and that made him act. This is the pivot. Shame stops being a weight. Shame starts being a propeller.
I refuse to feel like this anymore. I refuse to live like this anymore.
That refusal, that defiant spark, is the beginning of strategy. It's when you stop reacting and start acting. Strategy is the antidote to shame. Shame is emotional and passive. Strategy is logical and active. David's first strategic act was laughably small, collecting cardboard boxes, but it was an act. It was a plan. It was a step, no matter how tiny, in a new direction. With that single act, he began to starve his shame. He began to feed his agency, learning to sell online, building shelves in his garage, tracking his profits on a spreadsheet, buying his first pallet. Each was another strategic move pushing shame into the background. He was too busy building to have time for hiding. This is the path out of the hole. You cannot think your way out of shame. You have to act your way out. Replace the narrative of failure with a narrative of effort. Replace the feeling of helplessness with evidence of progress. The shame might still whisper, but its voice gets fainter with every box you pack, with every sale you make, with every dollar you stack. You transform shame into strategy by taking the pain of your present and using it as a blueprint to design your future. You stop being the victim of your story, you become its architect. David's journey was not just about making money or escaping debt, it was about forging a new identity. He had entered his crisis as a man defined by his roles, a husband, a father, a manager, and his failures within them. He emerged as a centurion. A centurion is not defined by their circumstances, they are defined by their response to them. They are the architects of their own reality, the warriors who face down adversity not with despair, but with a plan. They understand that the greatest walls are not external but internal. They know that true freedom is a product of mindset, discipline, and relentless action. The centurion mindset accepts the brutal reality of the situation without surrendering to it. David accepted he was broke. He accepted he needed a second shameful job. He didn't live in denial, but he refused to let that be the end of the story. He saw his situation not as a verdict, but as a starting point. This is the core of the centurion ethos. Radical ownership. You own your mistakes, you own your challenges, you own your solutions. There is no one coming to save you. The responsibility, and therefore the power, is entirely in your hands. This is not a terrifying realization, it is the most liberating one of all. This new beginning for David was marked by a permanent shift in his perspective. He would never look at a problem the same way again. He now saw every challenge as an opportunity in disguise, every constraint as a prompt for creativity. He was no longer afraid of hitting rock bottom, because he knew from experience that rock bottom is the most solid foundation you can build on. The fear that had once paralyzed him was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding confidence in his own resilience. He had faced the worst, and he had not only survived, but he had thrived. He had become anti-fragile. The shocks that were meant to break him had only made him stronger. This is the new beginning that awaits anyone who adopts the centurion mindset. It is the end of blaming the world, of waiting for a lucky break, of drowning in self-pity. It is the beginning of a life of purpose, action, and self-reliance. David's financial situation had changed, but more importantly, he had changed. He had used the grind to sharpen himself into a weapon. His business was a success, but the real prize was the man he had been forced to become in order to build it. He was no longer just David Miller, he was a centurion, and his new life was just beginning. You may recognize yourself in David's story. Perhaps you are working one job or two or three just to keep your head above water. You feel the exhaustion deep in your bones. You feel the shame of not being where you thought you would be in life. Bills piling up, dreams fading, walls closing in. You feel the weight of the world on your shoulders and you feel like you are carrying it all alone. You are living the grind, and you have been told the grind is a punishment, a sign that you are losing, a life sentence of struggle with no chance of parole. I am here to tell you that is a lie. The grind is not a prison unless you allow it to be. It is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of your centurion training. Your grind right now, whatever it is your launch pad. The job you hate is the stable income that can fund your first move. The long, boring commute is the time you have to listen to a podcast that will teach you a new skill. The exhaustion you feel is the fuel that will ignite your desire for change. The shame that keeps you up at night can be the very thing that forces you to draw a line in the sand and demand a new life for yourself. Your circumstances are not your destiny. They are your raw materials. A centurion does not complain about the quality of the stone they are given, they simply begin to carve. Your second job, your debt, your struggle. You can choose to be crushed by them, or you can choose to pick up a hammer and chisel and begin to shape them into a staircase. It starts with a single decision. The decision to stop being a victim of your grind and to start being its master. It starts the moment you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, how can I use this? Do not despise your struggle. It is the most valuable asset you have. It is your teacher, your motivator, and your ultimate source of strength. The person who has never struggled cannot build. The person who has never faced desperation cannot innovate. Your grind is giving you the calluses, the resilience, and the hunger that comfort can never provide. It is preparing you for the battle ahead. Your grind is your launch pad. The only question is whether you will have the courage to light the fuse. David's story is not a fairy tale. It is a blueprint. It is a testament. Any person with the right mindset and right strategy can transform their life. He didn't have a special Ivy League education. He didn't have a rich uncle. He didn't have a winning lottery ticket. He had 2 jobs, a mountain of debt, a family to provide for. He had a problem. He turned that problem into power. He stopped being a scroll-crushed worker. He became a centurion. He used his burdens as a launch pad for freedom. He found the path. Now I invite you to walk it. You don't have to figure this out alone, scavenging in the dark. The path has been cleared, strategies codified, the community built. We created a place for warriors like you, where the grind is not shame but strength. This is OLP 365, an arsenal, a training ground, a brotherhood. We don't offer sympathy, we offer strategy, not platitudes, a real plan. At OLP 365, you'll learn practical, real-world tactics to turn your income into a weapon. Build multiple streams of income. Turn your side hustle into an empire. Achieve financial freedom on a timeline you control. You will be surrounded by other centurions. People who understand because they live it or lived it. They will hold you accountable. They will share victories. They will remind you, you are not alone. The choice is yours. Continue the grind, or decide to change right now. Take the first step onto the launch pad. Join the ranks who refuse to be defined by jobs or debt. Become the architect of your freedom. The blueprint exists. The community is waiting. Join OLP 365. Begin your transformation from a man crushed by 2 jobs to a centurion who uses them to conquer the world. Your new beginning starts today.